Welcome back. The very last part of the seminar, I'm going to show you the 8 things that I use in Photoshop. And the reason I'm showing this to you is because Photoshop can be a very intimidating program for beginners. And as I've tried to highlight for you through most of the weekend, if your light and composition are good, then you really don't need the post-processing. The version of Photoshop I'm using right now is CC 2014. And the user interface has remained remarkably consistent across the years. So by the time you're seeing this at home on your DVD player, you may say, well, newer versions are out. But the tools are actually very similar. The icons are the same. And even if you're not using Photoshop, most of these tools are available on all of your popular photo editing programs. So the first image I want to show you is going to show off 3 different features. One is cropping, and everybody knows what cropping is, so that's not really going to be a big deal. But using these 3 tools, I'm going to take the image going from the upper left-hand corner here, which is an average snapshot, and I'm going to turn it to this, which is a little bit better composed, a little bit better exposure and white balance. Let's see how it goes. The first tool I want to introduce you to is the cropping tool. Every program that does photo editing has it, and they all use this same icon. It looks almost like a tic-tac-toe sign with 2 of the legs missing. Where did that icon come from? The answer is, back in the graphic arts days, when you had people doing print shops and all that, there was a tool used for proportional resizing, and it consisted of 2 pieces of cardboard in L shapes, one right side up, one upside down, and you can actually expand or contract this device proportionally to help you enlarge things. Let me go to the picture in question. Let me open it up. And if I can't find it, I'll just, there it is. There it is. Nice snapshot. And the crop tool is going to be over here on the left. Most of your major tools are here on the left on Photoshop. The cropping tool looks just like that. I'll press it, and I'm going to put the subjects kind of like this. Notice I can make this any proportion I want. Long and skinny. That's not always good when you're going to be making prints of this. Whenever you crop it and you have prints as your end result, you want to make things proportional to 4:6. And so instead of leaving the cropping nice and free like this, I'm going to cancel what I'm doing, and I'm going to enter some dimensions into the spaces in the crop above. You can define your ratio to be 4:3, which is proportional to 4:6. So if you enter the dimensions of your final product, no matter what you do, it's always going to be in that dimension. And I'm going to, and notice it has that rule of thirds grid right there. Some of the cameras will show you. I'm going to put me and my wife roughly at the rule of thirds. So what we're actually leaving out is all this dead information up here in the picture, which doesn't really add to it. And then I'm going to hit the check mark button up here. And there we go. That's not much better to crop. Okay, big deal. Usually, to make pictures go from good to great, you want to do a lot of small things, and then they all add up. Don't do any big thing, because then it looks like you photoshopped it. So the second thing I want to do is called the curves tool. Now the curves tool takes a little bit of explanation. But once you understand what this does, you realize that this is the most powerful thing since sliced bread. How can I ever use a photo editing program without it? To explain what it does, I want you to close your eyes and think back to high school or junior high school, when they taught you in algebra about curves and you were converting Fahrenheit to centigrade or Celsius. I never knew which is the right term. What they would used to do back in my day is you draw a graph to convert from one to the other. Celsius was on the bottom, and on the y-axis was Fahrenheit. And if you wanted to convert from one to the other, say you wanted to know what 10 degrees Celsius was, well, you go to the Celsius scale, you look up 10, you go up to the curve, and wherever it hits the curve, you then go back and read where the corresponding y value. And it's about 50, right about there. And sure enough, the 50 conversion from centigrade, from Celsius 10 to Fahrenheit is 50. And that's how the curve can convert from one thing to another, from your input to the output. The curves for Photoshop work exactly the same way. Now, let me give you an example here. To get the curves tool, you go to Image, Adjustments, Curves, ... And you can see the keyboard shortcut there, Control-M. Here, 2 things come up. This is a curves tool, and behind the curves tool, you see a histogram of your brightness display inside the image you're manipulating. Now remember, Celsius, you got your input on the bottom and your output on the y-axis. So let's look at what our input is right now and our output is right now. Our input is the way the image is before. The output is going to be after, and we have a straight 45-degree line in. So before, let's say you have a black pixel. What's it going to be after? Well, you can start with 0, because 0 represents black. Goes, hit the curves, go to the left, the output 0. So input 0, output 0, no change. What about a midtone? Say it's 155. Go up, hit the line, come back, the output's 155. The middle hasn't changed. Same thing with the end. When you have a straight line, the input and the output are the same. But what if I did this? What if I was able to grab the curve and move it like that? What would happen to the low end, the mid-range, and the highs? Well, the low end, the blacks, let's see, 0 in, hit the curve, 0 out, blacks haven't changed. How about the whites? 255 in, hit the curve way at the top, go to my y-axis, 255 out. The whites haven't changed. What about the midtones? 155 in, hits the curve somewhere up here, higher than 155 out, maybe 170, maybe 180. So what I've done with the curves tool is I've adjusted just the midtones, but I haven't touched the darks and I haven't touched the whites. It's a way to selectively manipulate parts of the image while leaving the others intact. It's a very, very handy thing. So if you want your image to look a little brighter and a little happier, you grab the middle of the curve and you just kind of increase it like that. Or I'm going to show you an example where you, in a second where the contrast was just horrible. You would start to manipulate the ends. And let me jump ahead and actually do that, because I think it's a really important example showing curves. Somebody has sent me a picture of a whale tail taken on a really, really blah day, and it's not here. So let me pull that out of the PowerPoint presentation. Here it is. Here's before and here's after. Adjusting the curves can go from this low contrast shot to this high one. Let me take the low contrast shot, drop it into Photoshop, and show how it's done with using curves. I'm going to hit File, New, ... and then when you do File, New, it looks in the clipboard for the size of the images there that you copied, and it suggests, do you want to make a new picture of these dimensions that you copied? I'm just going to say yes, and then a blank canvas drops, and I'm going to hit Control-V to paste it, and there's my image. Man, that's low contrast. If I go to the curves right now, remember, curves will show you the histogram of what your image looks like. And as you can see, using this histogram, there are no whites at all, and there are no blacks at all. You have 3 different kinds of shades of gray is what you have. In a perfect picture, you want there to be blacks, and you want there to be whites, and you want to be able to change that curve to make sure the output has, the whites in your output should match the whites of your input. The whites of my input are right here. So I want to adjust the whites of my output to be just adjacent, just a little bit larger than the whites of my input. So now my whites are white. I want the blacks of my output to match the blacks of my input. The blacks of my input are here. So I'm going to drag the blacks from my output to match the blacks of my input right about there. So now I've matched the input to the output. The input was very low contrast, no blacks, no whites, and now I've adjusted the curves so that we have blacks and we have whites in the image. And there's the final version. Before, after, just by adjusting the curves. I was able to save bad light on a bad day by bumping up the contrast. It turns out you can bump up contrast and save a lot of really hazy days. And bumping up contrast has other advantages too. For example, here, you can clean dirty windows, because dirty windows will just lower the contrast. So you just add a little bit more blacks. Move the lower left-hand portion of the curve over to the left. You increase your blacks without touching anything else. And as you can see in this picture, I added a little bit of yellow as well to give it a little bit of life. Here I just, again, took away the blacks by moving the lower left-hand corner of the curve to the right. And then I added some yellow, which ironically makes greens greener. You wouldn't expect that. But I went from that scene on the left to the scene on the right. And which one looks better to you? Mild adjustments. Mild adjustments is all you need to go good to great. And that's all about color balance. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go back to the Model T picture that we were editing. So I've done two things. I've done two things so far. I've cropped it, and now I'm going to apply the curves. Now, there's already plenty of blacks here, and the whites are already fine, so I'm happy with those. And as you can see by the histogram, you know, I got good whites, I got good blacks, there's nothing being blown out, but I want the picture to look happier. I'm going to grab the middle and make it a little bit brighter, like that. Now, me and my wife look great, and that's my subject. So now it's a happier image. So we went over curves, we talked about that. We talked about, here's some curve shortcuts. If you want to make the whites whiter, you grab the top right corner of the curve and move it that way. If you want to make the blacks blacker, you move the bottom left-hand corner and move it to the right. That just adds blacks and doesn't touch the midtones as much. Doesn't touch the whites at all. There's a story behind this one. This was back in 1988, and I was a photographer for a historic cultural exchange between Soviet and American high school students. So this is back in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Republic of Latvia, and there were statues of Lenin everywhere. It was almost a joke at the time. And I was very young at the time, and I said, you know what? Tourists take pictures of these statues. I'm not a tourist. I'm a serious artist. I am not going to lower myself to taking pictures of a statue of Lenin. And so I didn't. At least I didn't think I did. And I went through, and then 20 years happened, the Soviet Union fell, and then I became a stock photographer, and suddenly pictures of ordinary things from 20 years ago increase in value, especially when they're not around anymore. Okay, so 20 years later, there was a reunion in Latvia. I went, I did a magazine article about the differences between the Soviet Union then and Russia now. Ever since that trip, I kicked myself for not getting a good stock shot of Lenin because now they're valuable. It's history now. During the 20th anniversary, I went through my old slides, and I found this, which I had thrown away and just forgotten about. Apparently, I decided, oh, all right, I'll cover my bases, I'll take one. All right? Now, I shot on slides. As we all know about slides, you either get the light right in the camera or you don't. And because I was shooting blind, and I was shooting something that was backlit on an overcast day, the exposure came out just awful. This is a slide over here on the left. Okay, 20 years later, can I scan this into my computer and use the magic of Photoshop to make things look better, even though I did such a miserable job in my youth? So I scanned it in, and I did some pretty serious curve manipulation here. The curve manipulation was so serious that I started to get some color artifacts in my subject. This is what happens with extreme manipulation. And this is the reason why some professionals will say it's better to manipulate a 16-bit TIFF image than an 8-bit TIFF image. Because when you do extreme manipulation, you won't get as much of this color shifting with 16 bits as you get with 8. And of course, my other part of me says, well, if you get the exposure right, you don't need to do such an extreme manipulation. But here I am. I'm eating my own dog food here, okay? So I scanned it in, 16-bit TIFF in Photoshop. I did extreme manipulation curves. As you can see, I brightened the midtones. I kind of kept the whites exactly where they are. I don't want more of them. And I added some blacks here. So I got that. And then I wanted to make it normal, so then I turned it into a black and white image. Because after all, we all know that all history is black and white, and all modern day stuff is color. At least in the era I grew up, that was true. If it was before I was born, it was in black and white. And that's how I was able to save Lenin. And I mentioned this already, how to clean dirty windows with curves, how to cut out haze with curves. Curves are excellent. Now here I mentioned I added some yellow as well. How do you change the white balance in Photoshop? Yesterday we showed you how to do it in the camera by changing the automatic white balance to some of these presets, and then there was custom white balance where you tell the camera, this is white, I want you to make it white. And the camera will add whatever colors it needs to add or take away whatever colors it needs to take away to make that white. So you can do the white balance in camera. If you shoot raw, or if you're not happy with what the camera did, then you can go to Photoshop and change it. The color balance tool is a pretty straightforward thing to do. as you know, you've got three main colors for additive colors. You got red, green, and blue. And then on the other side of the scale, there's the opposite of red, green, and blue, which is cayenne, magenta, and yellow. To call up the color adjustment tool, let me get an image to work on first. And I'm going to dispel a myth at the same time. A lot of you have probably heard the myth that it's better to, if you're going to be changing the white balance later on, it's better to shoot it in RAW, and then you can choose your white balance later. It's not well known that if you shoot it in JPEG and you get the white balance wrong, you can still correct it in Photoshop. You can't correct it as much, but for most needs, you can still do it. Now, as we showed you yesterday, whenever you put your camera into incandescent light mode, who remembers what it does?
It's a lot of orange, right?
It adds, it's orange. To compensate for it, it adds a lot of blue. Indiscriminately, it just puts a blue filter on the image and it cancels out the yellow and everything looks good. So let's see if we can do the same thing here. I'm going to adjust this a little bit. Now that's as big as the image is, isn't it? And I'm going to bring up the color balance control by going to Image, Adjustments, should be Color, ... And here we go. And this is the graphic I showed you in the PowerPoint. Red, green, and blue on the right, cayenne, magenta, and yellow on the left. Now, right now, I can tell you there's two things I want to adjust. One, there's too much yellow and there's too much red. Let's take care of the yellow first. I'm going to take the yellow-blue slider and move it toward the blue. It's getting there. Now we can take the red and take some of the red away. So I'm going to move the red cayenne slider toward the cayenne. And that's getting pretty good right there. Now I've been eyeballing it like this for years, and it works pretty well. There is a faster way. And believe it or not, it's in the curves tool, so you can get two things done at the same time. Let me go back. This, by the way, is called your history panel. Everything you do with the shot shows up in a history list. And you can undo one step, or two steps, or multiple. You can go back as far as you need to, in case you don't like something. So I'm going to undo the color shift, and I'm going to do it again. But this time, instead of going to color mixer, I'm going to go back to curves, because curves has a nice tool. In addition to being able to adjust the brightness and the midtones and the blacks, there's also this eyedropper tool on the bottom. Now, remember I mentioned that with the custom white balance, you can point your camera to something white and you say, make that white. Do what you need to do to make it white. This is exactly the same thing, except you can do it in Photoshop. You can take a white eyedropper, or a gray eyedropper, or a black eyedropper. Let's do a white one, because I'm going to show it a white surface right now. I'm going to point to a white surface and say, do what you need to do to make that white. Now. There. And it did. Didn't do a very good job. But you can see what it's done here. It's had a different curve for different colors, which is hard to do manually. So this can actually save you a lot of time. Don't like it? Try it again. Let's try a different. If I try a different white there, that's too much. So that really wasn't white. Now here's a case where, again, the automated tools do a good job, and I like the job I did manually better. But that's a tool that you can use. Let me try one more. Let me try it once more to see if I can get it right. I'll point to the gray one, and I'll point to something neutral, not white, but gray, and say, here, make that. Well, that's probably the best so far. That's a little, and look at the curve manipulation here. We got blues way up here and reds way down there, which is very close to what I did with the sliders, remember? I moved the red, the yellow blue in one direction and the red cayenne in the other direction. That's what's happening here. So I'm going to start with that, and I'm going to fine tune it a little bit. What's it missing? A little bit of warmth. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow and a little bit of red to give it some life. If I had any complaint about Lightroom at all, is that you can't add red or cayenne to your image. It gives you 2 color sliders for adjusting white balance instead of 3. And I never understood why, because whenever I want to make things look lively, I always add a little bit of yellow and a little bit of red, and Lightroom doesn't let me do it. So I have to rely on their eyedropper tool to do it right. I can't do it the old-fashioned way. So, even though it was a JPEG, and even though the white balance was wrong in the camera, I was able to fix it later on in Photoshop. Because, yes, RAW files are more malleable, but JPEGs are pretty manipulatable too. We have other examples here, and again, the same tools I use, I've showed you already, can go from auto mode, which is always going to overexpose your forest, and it's always going to get the wrong white balance, to something a little bit darker. I underexpose while I stop, I added some blacks and I added a little bit of yellow, which ironically makes a forest greener. Why don't you add green? Not as good. It's strange. Same thing, shot from an airplane. This was taken right out of the camera, added some blacks, added some yellow, that's my shot. I just tweak it a little bit. Let's talk about the least understood tool in Photoshop. And this also has the worst name ever, but it's historically significant. The unsharp mask tool is the tool that you use to make things sharper. Why in the world would you call something that makes things sharper unsharp?
Because you're Adobe.
No, there's a reason for it, and it's historically significant. Back in the olden days, when you had film and you had an image that was slightly out of focus, there's no sharpening in Photoshop or anything. If you wanted to make it look sharper, there's an optical illusion that you could use. First, you make a duplicate negative that's just slightly out of focus on purpose. Then you take the original negative and the duplicate negative that's slightly out of focus, the unsharp mask, and you sandwich them together. You put them in the enlarger and you print it. It's an optical illusion, but the final version looks sharper than the original image that doesn't have the unsharp mask put on top of it. Why does that work? I don't know, but it fools the eye. And that's a technique that we're using for many, many, many years. And so Adobe, you look for the old techniques when you have modern ways of doing things. They named this the unsharp mask tool because it simulates the same thing that putting an out-of-focus mask or duplicate negative on top of the original does. It simulates the same thing of making it look sharper than it actually is. Unsharp mask has 3 variables. The first thing I want to do is go to the unsharp mask tool. That's in Filter, Sharpen, and Adobe gives you several different methods of sharpening things. The only one I've really liked, because I really understood what it was doing, was the unsharp mask option, which is the last option in the menu. Unsharp mask. And then it gives you these 3 values here: amount, radius, and threshold. And you can play with these things all day long. I've played with it all day long for many, many, many years. I discovered that there are 2 major categories where a certain set of settings will work very, very well. You want to have your end in mind. If you're going to be printing it very large, there's one set of numbers you can use. If you're going to be optimizing it for the web, there's another set of numbers you can use. And if you look at your handouts, I've itemized it for you. Here it is, the recommended unsharp mask values. When you're making prints and enlargements, you want to set the numbers to 90.9 and 0. When optimizing for web and email, you want the numbers to be 500.2 and 0. Up on the display, you'll really be able to see the effect that the second batch of numbers does. Plus, we're looking at it essentially as what's the web. It's a low resolution display. So let me show you how it works here. We're going to go back to Photoshop. First of all, it's not good to pixel people. Let me set this to 50%, which is a proper magnification to use when you're evaluating the sharpness. Let's go to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. There's the 3 numbers, and I'm going to optimize it for web viewing. So 500, 0.2, and 0. Now, for every Photoshop action you have, or every filter, or every function, there's always this preview box over here, which you can turn on and off. Right now it's on. That's the effect it's going to have. Off, on, off. It's very, very subtle. I'm wondering, can you even see the effect on the screen? No, you can't. Let me zoom into 100% and try it again. Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. 500.2. Before, after. The plate, you can see it. You look at the numbers, especially around the second hand. It's very, very subtle. You don't want to over sharpen things. You do not want to over sharpen things, because if you do, you start to see things like that, and it starts to look photoshopped, and it starts to look. It's not real. People are going to say, "You're not a real photographer. You photoshopped that." Of course, nobody thinks that anymore. Now you don't Photoshop it, you're not a real photographer. It's amazing how times change. But I always believe in doing things very, very subtly, so it doesn't look like you Photoshopped it. and I found that 500.2 and 0 makes it look ultra crisp for web viewing. Every time you make an image smaller, which is what I recommend you do whenever you're emailing it for the web, every time you throw pixels away, you fuzzify the image a little bit. It's necessary to restore the sharpness that was there by using the unsharp mask tool every time you resize an image. So this isn't to enhance sharpness, this is to get it back after you made it fuzzy after you resized it. And that's the history of unsharp mask, and that's how it's actually used. If you were actually going to go and print it, I'd recommend using a different set of numbers. Sharpen, unsharp mask. You want to use, if your camera is less than 6 megapixels, and none of them are anymore, you'd be using 90 and 0.9. If you're more than 6 megapixels, I'd recommend using like 120 and 0.9, a little bit more intense. And here you can see the difference pretty clearly, especially in the Swiss icon over there. It's off, on, off, on. It's very, very subtle. But when you make the print, it makes a difference. Okay, the next tool I use, I actually do it a lot. On day one, we talked about how it was so easy to have a distracting background when you're taking the picture, because you're not thinking about the background. You're thinking about your subject and are they smiling, and you're not seeing that tree growing out of their head. Well, with Photoshop, you can make that tree go away. And on this shot here, there was a volleyball net over here on the left, and there's a couple signs here and here. I thought it was a visual distraction, and on this side, I got rid of them. Now, had I spent more time, I would have gotten rid of that telephone pole, and there's all sorts of things you can do to clear out the background. But here's the way I did it. I used something called a clone stamp tool. Cloning means you pick up a bunch of pixels over here, and you drop them off over here. And if you're very careful, you can be very clever about how it works. I'm going to start off with a very simple example. So the way the photo clone stamp tool is, it looks like a rubber stamp. So you pull from here and you stamp, 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 stamp. So I'm going to give you an example of how not to use it. First, let me select the stamp tool. First, you have to tell Adobe Photoshop, pull the pixels from here. So I hold down my Alt key. For those of you who have a Macintosh, what key do you hold down? Command. You hold down the Command or the Alt key, and then you click. And that tells Adobe, pull your sample from here. Then you can go anywhere else and click, and you will deposit a copy of that sample anywhere.
Hi there, it's me. Pardon me for interrupting. I had to do this again because the demonstration of the clone stamp tool did not work properly in the studio. So here we are again. Here's our screen, here's the image, and as I recall, I was just adjusting the size of this circle by pressing the right bracket key to make it bigger, as you can see on the bottom, and the left bracket key to make it smaller. So here's how the clone stamp tool works. The idea is you can pick up pixels from here and drop them to here. And here's how it works. Using the PC, you hold down the Alt key, or the Command key if you're on an Apple. Hold down the Alt key, and then you click on the group of pixels you want to pick up, in this case, the blue sky. Then you can drop them anywhere. Take that circle, put it anywhere, and then drop it. And I just dropped the sky onto the bottom. Now that's not very useful, but there's two things I wanted you to see. One, here's how it drops pixels. And two, see how fuzzy the edges are? You can actually adjust that up here. And this little teensy-weensy window, you can adjust the size of your circle from here, in addition to using the right bracket or the left bracket. And you can also adjust the hardness, which is how fuzzy the edges of that circle are. I'm going to move it to about 80%. There it is. And then I'm going to try this again. Let me also introduce you to the history tool. This allows you to undo things step by step, one thing or many things. In this case, I just go up and I'm back to the way the image was restored. Also going to introduce you to the navigation key up here. You can zoom in and zoom out, so you can work on things in detail. So my goal is to pick up pixels from the top of the line and then drop them to the bottom. My circle for this task is too big, so I'm going to shrink it down a little bit. Now I'm going to do a real-time change. Now watch how this happens. First, I'm going to pick up the pixels from just above the wire. Alt, click. Then I'm going to click, and then while I'm clicking, you're going to drag across the wire. Now notice what's happening. There's a little tiny plus sign right above the circle. That's telling you that Photoshop is pulling the pixels from the plus sign and depositing them right where the circle is. And I'm going to go all the way here. I'm going to stop right before I hit the building. Let's go to the right of the building, and let's do the same thing. This time I'm going to pull pixels from here, below the wire. Alt, click. Now I'm going to go up. And now notice I'm pulling from the plus sign below. And some clouds get duplicated too. I'll stop there and do it again. Pull pixels from here. Alt click. Drop, 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 drop. Okay, that was the easy part. Let's see what we can do about the building. What I'm going to do now is make this circle even smaller. Left bracket, left bracket, left bracket, left bracket. And I'm going to pull pixels from right here, right at the diagonal. And I'm going to deposit them right over here. Not bad. And let's go and pull pixels from this diagonal. Alt click, deposit, right there. Great. And then it's just a matter of patching up whatever is left. Alt click, paste, 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 paste. Alt click, paste, Alt click, paste. And there you go. I couldn't do anything about the wire being in the shot initially, so I just removed it in Photoshop. Ha! And now back to our regularly scheduled seminar.
One more example I want to show you. Taking advantage of RAW. Earlier we talked about how RAW had a slightly wider dynamic range than JPEGs did. And I showed you this very example where with the JPEG, the sky was washed out, but in RAW, we were able to recover it. There are two ways of getting it. The old way, which is before Lightroom, and the new way after Lightroom. The old way before Lightroom was time intensive, and I didn't like it, and that's one of the reasons I tried to shoot with JPEG as much as I could, because RAW was just a pain. Then Lightroom came out, and it makes it so easy and so invisible. There's almost no extra effort to process RAW. And let me show you what I've done. I can do this one now in about 10 seconds instead of 10 minutes like it took me the first time. Let's open this image up in Photoshop. And when I do so, an intermediate screen will come up. Now, when it opens up a RAW file, remember what happens. Demosaicing happens. And then during this process, you can also do other things. You can recover the highlights, you can play with the shadows, you can play with the curves before it does its demosaicing thing and then bringing it over to Photoshop in 16-bit mode. The first thing it gives you is all these tools here. You can adjust the exposure. All right, that's pretty straightforward. You can make the whole thing brighter or you can make the whole thing darker. Notice how much detail there is in the sky there when you make everything darker. Just like with the curves, you can change just the highlights but leave the midtones and the shadows alone. So too can you do this with Lightroom. You can just worry about the highlights and leave everything else alone, but instead of using curves, you use these sliders. If I move the highlights to the left, it'll just darken things that are bright. For example, the sky. And it's not touching anything else in the picture. So this is the fastest way on earth to recover your blown out highlights. And when I say blown out, I mean almost blown out. Because once they're blown out, you can't recover it like I just did. That's where the histogram is really important. You have to make sure that it's to the edge but not over the edge. You can use this shadows tool here, go up and increase everything in the shadow region. It's equalizing things greatly. So here I got my highlights all the way to 0 and my shadows all the way to the top. And man, that's a beautiful picture. A whole lot better than what I had to the left. And it took me 10 seconds. Now you can also have other things you can adjust. You know, you can make your whites whiter, your blacks blacker, and you can tweak things as well. And you can also do ridiculous things like increasing what they call the clarity, which makes things look a little photoshopped, or the vibrance, where the colors get ridiculously strong. And again, if you do too much of any of this stuff, it looks like you manipulated it. But you just do a small collection of subtle things, it works out well. So that looks pretty realistic to me. Then I'm going to hit Open Image. And then it does the demosaicing, and whatever adjustment I had it do, and then it opens up in 16-bit mode in Photoshop. From there, I can save it as a 16-bit TIFF or a Photoshop file, a PSD file. Or I can say, okay, that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to save it as a JPEG. And then it's going to turn it into 8-bit mode, throw away information that the brain can't perceive, compress it so it takes up less memory on the memory card, and then export it. But man, it's perfect. So, and you won't see any JPEG compression artifacts at this point. Yes?
When you save it as a JPEG, there are various levels?
Yes. When you save, okay. When you save it as a JPEG, let's do a save as here. It's going to save it as a JPEG. And when you do, it's going to ask you what quality level you want. Now I'm going to show you a slide that I skipped earlier, because now it's relevant. Here are 4 examples of JPEG compression artifacts. Remember what I said earlier, when the Joint Photographic Experts Group got together, they defined what information gets thrown away, they defined the algorithms for compressing the information and how much loss is acceptable, but they didn't say how much compression you can do. They left that one up to the user. And that's why when you save things as a JPEG, Photoshop is going to ask you, what quality do you want? And you can go from 1 to 12. Well, here's a program that let me go from 1 to 100. 1 was the best quality, and here it was. It was now this is a close-up of a mountain with the best JPEG quality there was, almost no compression at all. What happens if you have the compression at half quality? Well, so on a scale from 1 to 100, this was 50. Quality is still pretty good. In fact, I can't even see any JPEG compression artifacts here. What happens if we compression even lower? They specify a quality of 80. From a scale from 1 to 100, this is 80. Here you're starting to see JPEG compression artifacts crawling up, especially in the sky. Smooth gradations turn into big chunks of approximations because separate colors are pulled and averaged together, and now you got blocky compression artifacts. Now what happens if we go whole hog, specify the lowest quality possible on a scale from 1 to 100? This is 100, the worst quality possible. That's blocky, that's low quality, that's horrible, that's unacceptable.
Yuck.
Yuck. In fact, it even says yuck right there. So that's the range. Photoshop will not let you get this bad. And I've discovered that even the lowest quality modes are still pretty good. But hard disk space is cheap and plentiful now. There's not enough compelling reason to compress an image a lot anymore. So whenever Photoshop asks me, you want to save this as a JPEG? I'll say yes. I'll just say test. I'll say save, and then it'll ask me in the next step, what's your quality you want? I always set it to maximum. For some reason, 12 is the best quality. I don't know how they arrived at 12. Why not 13? And even bandwidth is cheap. You know, in the olden days when websites first came out, you'd want to save it with a low quality because that image would be smaller and it would take less time to download over a 300 baud modem. Well, nobody has those anymore. There's no reason to store low quality JPEGs ever. Did I over-answer your question?
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
What I just showed you here is just scratching the surface. You can spend your whole life learning about Lightroom and Photoshop. It's kind of like learning Unix. They have the same learning curve. And what I'm telling you is, you don't need to traverse that path. Just the simplest of editing tools, and getting good light in your camera is the best way to get wow shots without wasting your life going down the Photoshop path. So, a quick review of what we did today. We covered a lot of technical stuff. We talked about what a fast shutter speed will do. It will freeze things that are moving, and a slow shutter speed will make things that are moving relative to the camera appear blurry. And that's why panning shots work, because the background is moving relative to the camera, but not your subject. We talked about what a small f-stop does. It lets in less light, but it also makes things in front of your focus point and behind your focus point look more and more in focus the smaller and smaller your lens opening gets. Every time you change the shutter speed, make it faster or slower, you have to adjust the f-stop by an equal amount, an equal and opposite amount to make sure the same amount of light comes in. And we talked about the four famous exposure modes, P, A, S, and M. Program mode will choose an f-stop and a shutter speed for you for your ambient light. And it'll also select an ISO for you if you have ISO set to auto. This is the mode that I personally prefer when I'm out in the field because it lets me get the shot fast. And then when I go to say, how do I make it better? How do I make it better? I'll often take it out of program mode and then figure out what to do and then adjust the camera accordingly. Shutter priority mode. You tell the camera what shutter speed you want in case you're shooting sports or in case you want to blur. And it will make other adjustments to make sure the picture comes out 18% gray. Aperture priority. You tell it the f-stop. It will set the shutter speed based on the ambient light and the ISO. Manual exposure, you're in charge. I should add that with some cameras, including Nikon and now Sony on their higher end cameras, when you're in manual exposure mode, they now allow you to have ISO set to auto. If you want to get confused and have your head scratch a lot, keep your ISO set to auto because you'll be making all these adjustments, you'll let in less light, and no matter what you do, the image still looks 18% gray. That's because the camera's trying to adjust things. So if you ever switch to manual exposure mode and you really want to take control, make sure your ISO is not set to auto, and then you'll be getting exactly what you expect to get. We talked about image stabilization features and how we'll give you a 3-stop advantage over the old-fashioned way, which is 1 over your focal length in terms of shutter speeds that you can use. We talked about how to take time exposures. Put your camera on a tripod, leave the shutter open for a long period of time, and use a cable release to make sure that your finger isn't inducing shakiness into your image. Talked about histograms. Is anybody intimidated by histograms anymore?
Yes.
No, good. I've done my job. My work here is done. And we talked about RAW versus JPEG. There are advantages of each. There are drawbacks of each. There is no right or wrong thing to shoot. There's just what's right for what you're shooting. We talked about JPEG compression artifacts, which you will no longer see out in the wild. You have to really manufacture them in order to be able to show them in a seminar like this. And then we talked about the most common image tweaks that I do in Photoshop or any other image editing program because they all have these same basic controls. So I want to wrap up this weekend by saying a couple things. Number one, please tell everybody about my books. As I mentioned yesterday, word of mouth is my only means of advertising, and only extremely happy customers will tell other people about it. If you like this seminar, please go online and tell people about it. I just want to end with one additional thought. I know there's a lot of things competing for everyone's time, and to be able to invest a weekend of your life, as you've done here, to improve your photography, I'm honored that you chose to spend that weekend with me, and I hope that you'll be able to, 30 years from now, take pictures and say, wow, this is a great weekend. It's changed my photography forever, and me and all my family are thankful for these new improved images. Thank you for coming here.